Hey everybody, John Greenwood here. Today I'm giving an updated overview of my medieval campaign system, what it is, how it evolved, and what it looks like after my latest iteration. I previously had a video explaining the basics of this system, but it's changed so much that it's basically unrecognizable, and I've run, 6 or 7 scenarios with it, and I've learned a lot of hard lessons along the way. Other people have also played it now and given feedback on what works and what doesn't, so this video overrides the old one, and that's why it was taken down. So here's what the system is. The rules are designed for campaign scale play. You're not simulating every skirmish, you're just covering an entire campaign, maybe up to a full year of war compressed into actual play, but I'll explain that. The game includes strategic and operational maneuvering, sieges, supply and money complications, and politics. And it's been designed in a way where you can sort of duct tape your own tactical system onto it. I have a tactical system if you would like to use it, but I assume you have your own, and this is just sort of the world map view of your medieval game. In terms of turns, each turn represents 7 days, and most games last less than 7 turns, which is quite shocking to hear, but it's true. Players tend to do crazy things immediately, and then there's a clear winner and loser well before you hit 7 turns. And this isn't an accident. This actually does reflect real history. In medieval times, a lord would call his troops without paying them for roughly 30 to 40 days, which was known as sort of the levy period, which creates the classic so-called campaign season that medieval authors wrote about, which usually took place in August, and the system fits neatly inside that window. Most historical campaigns started in August and lasted 1 to 3 months, so the system reflects that reality fairly naturally without having to do anything complicated. If you want to simulate multiple years of warfare and keep this beast going, in terms of the winter months, you should simulate all of the winter months in one massive turn, because armies aren't going to be moving around on the map. It's just going to be diplomacy and stuff. So it's better to do that all in one go, and then go back to the normal time scale afterwards. In terms of the space that's taken up by a game, the game works best on a map of real-life geography, where you can just use Google Maps to check how far away things are and not have to open Tabletop Simulator. I'm talking about the player perspective right now. But for Westeros, you can't really open Google Maps and check, so I created a map for the players where each grid square is 5 miles, which is something that we arrived at through repeated playtesting. Speaking of movement, there's basically 2 components to the game. There is the sort of military maneuver stuff, and then there's, I guess I'll call it everything else. So let's talk about the military maneuver part. Historically, armies marched about 10 to 15 miles per day, leaning towards 10, but up to 15 if the settlement is close enough. The medieval author Christine de Pizan wrote during medieval times that armies marched at 2 miles per hour, so you can do the math from there on your own. And cavalry move at 4 miles per hour, but cover roughly the same distance. Forced marches average about 20 miles per day, but can go in extraordinary circumstances up to 30 miles per day, such as the French before Poitiers. And cavalry are similarly capped at a hard 30, which is the physical limit of a horse. The trickiest problem when you're encountering movement is coming up with these historical figures, to be sure, but also fatigue. How tired are your troops, and does that affect their combat effectiveness and their continued ability to march? I compiled a lot of data on this and found that armies need to rest roughly after 100 miles. And there was a big difference between the length of rest depending on whether you're cavalry or infantry. Cavalry need less rest than infantry, and infantry need somewhere between 3 and 7 days, depending on the circumstances. And for the sake of simplicity, I settled on a blanket rule of about 5 days of rest, because that seemed to be where most of the cases lied. So the idea is that after 100 miles of marching, most armies in most circumstances are going to need to rest for 5 days. And this applies equally to forced marches. You'll reach the threshold a lot faster, but you'll still need those 5 days. And until you've crossed that threshold, you can fight without penalty. Again, the French marched 30 days before the Battle of Poitiers, and fatigue was not a serious issue at that battle. Similar thing happened at Agincourt with the English force marching the day before. It's really not that big of a deal. The impact is probably overstated by historians. It doesn't seem to have a serious effect on the outcome of the battle. However, once you're at that threshold, that's when it does have an effect. So this single sort of principle replaces a whole lot of complicated fatigue mechanics, and it is very easy to administrate as an umpire and very easy to understand and remember as a player. So that is the sort of military maneuver part of this. In terms of core of the game part stuff, before we move on to the everything else, I need to talk about action points and word limits and the core game loop. So the other major design problem that I encountered was limiting what players can do in a turn, because they're going to attempt to do a gazillion things. This is to reflect the slower pace of medieval life and to also prevent one player from doing literally everything and rendering all of the other players on his team completely irrelevant. My first solution was action points, which helped a little bit, but it created more confusion than it resolved in the end. And players had difficulty remembering what counted as an action, how many action points does it cost, and the answer was often arbitrary and convoluted. So after talking about this after my most recent game, I went back to the drawing board. I was defending action points pretty hard, but after thinking about it, I don't think it's the way to go. After thinking about game design more broadly, I think the solution is to have a word limit for orders, which I was applying in my most recent game anyway. The philosophy behind this is really simple. If you want to do a bunch of small, straightforward things, then they're easily going to fit in the word count. But if you want to do the same number of complicated things, then the word limit is going to prevent you from doing that, which sort of elegantly solves a bunch of problems at the same time. It solves the delegation problem, because if the commander wants to do everything himself, he'll run out of his words, and then he'll have to hand the tasks off to his subordinates. And then also it prevents people from sort of rambling on and giving me orders that are way too long, because, if they want to do things, they have to fit within the word limit. And then also it naturally incentivizes people to be just as concise and simple as possible, so that they can do more in a turn. So really it seems like the best system, and it kind of mirrors reality a little bit and makes secondary characters actually matter. In practice, I found that the word limit had a far larger positive impact on my workload as an umpire and on the sort of flow of the game and the logic of the game than action points did. So I've removed action points from my system entirely. I might revisit them, but for the moment they've become more trouble than they're worth, and I thought it was worth explaining to other people my philosophy and my experiences with that. On to the core game loop. So each turn, there's basically 3 steps, right? You read, you talk, and then you write. Players read, hopefully, the updates that I give them. They discuss strategy with their teammates. Maybe they delegate who's going to do what, and then they write their orders. Simple 3-step process, okay? The word limit naturally forces delegation, as I mentioned before, and there's no action point categories to remember. Just a simple task of can you handle this personally, or do you need to have a subordinate do it because you don't have enough word count? Now, because the game runs in a play-by-post format, you can't afford to stop the game every time two armies meet on the map, for example, and wait for players to respond. Requiring players to react to every little event in real time is a fast track to a dead game, because someone in a different time zone goes quiet for the day, or worse, they just never respond to you at all, which, happens to every umpire. The solution is what I call stances and what other people might call conditionals. So players set a stance for their army in advance, and you use that to make judgment calls without interrupting the game. And this sounds very complicated, but it actually is very simple, and it works every time. Nobody has had any kind of complaint about this system. It just works. There were originally 7 stances, and I've cut it down to 4. Aggressive, which means you seek battle with the enemy, period. Bold, which means you seek battle with anyone smaller or equal to your force. Cautious, which means you engage only when you're heavily favored. And avoidant, which means you avoid any engagement at all, and you'll sacrifice units to cover your retreat. Dragons use the same 4 stances, and these stances cover the vast majority of conditionals that players want to set. With these stances in place, you can fully bypass the need for an interrupt when 2 armies or 2 dragons meet. If one army is aggressive and the other is avoidant, then the avoidant army is going to retreat, and the aggressive army probably doesn't catch them in time because the scouts gave them enough warning, and no conversation is required. Speaking of scouting, rather than asking players to specify how many scouts they send and how far they send them, something that most players have no intuition for, the game now assumes a sensible default. Your outriders are placed 5 miles forward and 5 miles behind your main body. Since cavalry move at roughly 4 miles an hour in a scouting roll, that's about an hour's warning. Combined with their own line of sight of roughly 2 miles, that gives your army an effective vision radius of about 15 miles of diameter, or 3 squares on the map. Outriders are only a token strength and flee at first contact by default to let you know where the enemy is coming from. And players can just specify in their orders if they want something different, but I am going to guess that they probably don't. Now we move on to the sort of everything else part of the game. I'll cover diplomacy only very briefly. Diplomacy is mostly handled on an ad hoc manner. I just read things and I sort of intuitively know what is reasonable and what isn't and how people are going to respond because I have formal training in this area, so a rules system would just kind of slow me down. I do have a legitimacy score to sort of indicate to players like how bad their political situation is. And I have a few optional die roll rules if you wanted to use that system. But for me personally, I mostly just use things ad hoc. I'm literally an expert in this subject matter, so that's just how I do that. And then sort of everything else, which is, communications, gold, and economy, and supplies. All of these things sort of run off of the same philosophy, which is I want to do as little work as humanly possible when administrating this game while still maximizing my level of realism. And I want the players to do the same thing. I want them to do as little work as possible while having, meaningful decisions. So you have to abstract things a little bit, and you also have to know how things work, which required me doing a lot of historical research, reading a lot of books to figure out how these things work. So I'll go over communications first. Medieval communications are important. There's a physicality to them. There's a physicality to everything in medieval times, and a lot of players don't understand this because most of your players are going to be young enough that they don't remember the world before digital communication was so widespread. And no player actually wants to manage courier relay networks, and most players have no idea how those networks work anyway. So trying to simulate it in detail kind of breaks immersion because they have no idea how to do it, and it's also painful to sort of adjudicate when you're the referee. So you abstract. You assume that characters handle these routine tasks competently because their medieval characters would have done this instinctively until something actually goes wrong. So if nobody's sabotaging the network, then there's no reason to simulate it in detail. To administrate communications specifically, I created a faction mail channel on Discord. Anyone on your team can post there. I originally set a 60-minute slow mode to simulate medieval mail delays. The idea was that it would limit most players to roughly 1 post per day without needing to actually track the courier travel times. The problem was that some players, especially the CIC, receive multiple messages, and they can't respond to all of them at once. So I've reduced it to a 30-minute slow mode. It's slightly less realistic, but there's still meaningful delays, and there's still an incentive to get co-located with your allies, and there's also still a real danger of communication lines being cut. The relay posts exist on the world map. I'm just not representing them, and I'm abstracting them until someone actually tries to sabotage them. For example, if you invested a city during a siege, you would be cut off from your communication lines and you wouldn't be able to send any messages, for example. The next thing is gold and economy. I went through several iterations on economy. First, I had no economy at all. Then I had ad hoc economy. Then I had chests of gold. Then I had individual coins for granularity. And now, after doing historical research, I'm back to chests with a simplified framework. So the key principles that I've landed are as follows. Gold has to be physically stored somewhere. Right? Gold is not a fiat currency like our modern system. Okay, everything is backed by a physical item, which means that it can be stolen. The way that this becomes relevant is for the first 6 turns, your troops don't need to be paid because they're under the levy system, or if you're in a time period where the levy system doesn't exist, you just assume that the commander was competent enough to provide funds for 6 turns worth of warfare, right? That's the alternative explanation. But after turn 6, you have to start paying your troops. And to do so, you have to somehow draw a line in your orders between where your gold is stored and where your troops are, and come up with a convincing explanation of how your gold is getting to your troops so that you can pay them. If that route is not very complicated, then I don't need details. But if it is complicated, or if enemies might intercept it, then I do need those details. And then in terms of raising gold, this became very tedious with regular income. But after historical research, I realized that actually this regular income didn't exist in medieval times. Gold, for war purposes in medieval times, is raised through special one-off taxes. In reality, medieval lords raised war taxes separately from the ordinary running of the realm, and every taxable asset under the system generates basically a chest of gold. Cities generate 2 chests. And then these would stack. So a city with a port and a mine, something like Lannisport, would generate 4 chests when you raise a tax. And then this sort of aligns with the general principle of passive management, right? We don't have to do the regular income, especially in medieval times, because it literally doesn't exist. So I only need to care about generating income, odds are once per game, because the hit to your legitimacy when you're raising taxes is going to be so severe that you can basically only afford to do it once, which puts another sort of natural limit on, your warfighting capabilities, etc. So there's lots of strategic considerations at play, and it's a lot less to juggle in your head, both as the person running the game and as a player. Like, as a player, you just need to remember, okay, I need money, then I need to raise special taxes, and it's going to cost me legitimacy every time I do it. So basically, I can only do this once, which means I got to wrap up my war by turn 6, maybe by turn 7 or 8, if I'm really pushing it. Definitely by turn 10 or 12, like, I can't be campaigning that long, which again sort of reflects real history, right? You don't want to be campaigning that long. It's incredibly expensive. And then, through this, looting becomes a lot easier to represent. Like, how much money do you get from looting? Well, you just simplify it by saying, well, you get the same amount of money that you would as raising a special tax, except this time, because you're looting, there's no legitimacy cost because looting was culturally expected during this period. And importantly, if the enemy has stored their treasury in a city and you loot it, then you take that gold as well. So taking 10 chests from the enemy would be effectively worth 20 chests of gold because you gained 10 and they lost 10. So targeting the enemy's treasury is a decisive strategic move, and now the system rewards it accordingly, so you can enact economic warfare against your enemies. Similarly, supplies are handled passively. You don't track them turn to turn. The system just assumes that your commanders are competent enough to handle their routine logistics without being told to do so, and they only become relevant when something bad happens. There's a siege, a scorched earth policy, sabotage of your supply wagons. This reflects the reality that an experienced commander wouldn't need somebody to tell him how much food his army needs to march from point A to point B. And then in terms of mustering, I simplified things, so each settlement generates a fixed number of troops based on its size, and I greatly simplified the number of size categories. Satellite towns and hamlets aren't tracked individually on the map. We just assume they exist and sort of fold their contribution to the nearest significant point. For the Game of Thrones setting, I said that every map point can muster at least 250 men, and I think that's what's written in the rules. But for historical settings, I would lower that to around 80 men, which is closer to the historical sort of Roman century level muster. In terms of sieges, what I figured out was that the sort of simultaneous nature of the campaign and the battle system does not accurately reflect the historical dynamic of a siege. What's more accurate, more faithful to the dynamics of a siege is a sequential turn instead of a simultaneous turn. So the attacker goes first, and then the defender reacts to what the attacker is doing because they would see from their walls, oh yeah, it looks like the guy is building belfry, right? It looks like he's building siege towers. What are we going to do about that? Oh, I guess we'll try and raise the walls a little bit, or, oh, I guess we'll, send our catapults to fling rocks at that thing and try to bring it down, I guess. You're reacting to what the enemy is doing fundamentally. It's a sort of cat and mouse game. So in terms of sieges, specifically, I would change it to a sequential sort of play style during a siege. If you're going to wrap it up in the campaign system, I would recommend keeping it to weeks long. Because here's the thing. If you're doing an assault, it's basically going to happen almost immediately. And if you're doing a prolonged siege, then no assault is happening at all, and you don't want to be sitting on your hands for days on end waiting for somebody to reply. So you just do week by week of the siege, and then you have the attacker go first, defender react, so that there's still the appropriate level of sort of interplay here. That also sort of more accurately reflects sieges of the time period. There's this misconception that every siege was just this long, drawn-out affair, and oh my god, it could last 6 months. And actually, when you look at the historical data, most sieges did not last 6 months. 6 months is an extremely long time for the siege, and we know this because of, first of all, the data that tells us this, But second of all, the medieval authors actually specify that 6 months was an extraordinarily long time. And the medieval authors actually tell us outright that most settlements were bluffing about how much food they had in their stores, right? Most settlements had 2 weeks at best of food in their stores, and after 2 weeks, they would completely capitulate. Usually what would happen is the army would walk up to the settlement, they would invest it, and they would deliver terms, and then they would say, okay, surrender or die, and then the settlement would probably say something along the lines of, give us 2 weeks. If nobody comes to relieve the siege in 2 weeks, then we will surrender the settlement without bloodshed. And then most of the time, the invading army would accept this, especially if it's like a minor nothing settlement. And the idea was that the reason that this was most often a week or two is because that's how much food was in the settlement. And so, once they ran out of food, resistance becomes futile and there's no reason to keep the siege going. You might as well surrender. So all of that is to say that these 6-month-long sieges are way out of the norm. They are the exception, not the norm. Feeding that many people required a Herculean effort, right? Christine de Pizan was describing the extensive lists of how many pigs you would need, how many pounds of flour you would need, and it was just for a few hundred soldiers. So the idea that thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers can hole up inside of a city for months on end without extensive costs and extensive preparations is just not historically factual at all. It does not reflect real history. Real history is that most sieges last less than 2 weeks. The vast majority of sieges last less than 2 weeks. The vast majority of sieges don't have any assault at all. The vast majority of sieges ended with the besieged party surrendering. If you're a garrison of maybe 20 guys in the middle of nowhere, and your lord is off in Paris, and you are being paid dog water to guard this middle of nowhere nothing post, and you watch King Henry come into view with 10,000 men, do you seriously think that you're going to be guarding this castle for even a second more than you have to? No, you're probably going to surrender right away. And that's historically what happened, is that the vast majority of these places just surrender right away. And so now it becomes very easy to understand how a medieval commander could conquer all these places so easily, because there's no standing army, right? You have to raise troops in advance, and the lord is off in the capital most of the time, so he's not even in his own castle to tell you to fight to the end and not surrender. It's the local castellan or even somebody below him who's running the garrison, and odds are that he's got maybe 20, 30 men defending the castle, and he's going to just give up if he sees an army that's big enough. Like, that's just the fact of it, and anything else is a historical anomaly. And suffice to say that people's conception of sieges is perhaps not the most historically accurate. So I wanted to correct that assumption and basically let you know that this week by week system is actually going to work if you want to do historically accurate medieval warfare. It does actually work. In terms of actually processing the game, a lot of people ask how I do this, and my way of processing the game really evolved over time. Originally, I just went through each Discord channel one by one and sort of just kept in the back of my mind, in my active memory, what was going down. And now the way that I do it is that I have a Google Doc of every order given in the game. And what I'll do is I'll go through each channel during the deadline, and I'll just copy and paste raw text of their orders, paste it into the Google Doc so that I collect everybody's orders in one place. Then I read through them, and then what I do is I write a sort of central umpire report, including every little update and every little bit of information all in one place. And I, segment them by, the category of information. So, if this was a siege, it would be the north wall, this is what's happening. Okay, on the west wall, this is what's happening. And then, you would filter that information through based on who can see those things happening or who would know those things. So all the players who are at the North Wall would get the North Wall update, and I would just copy it from my central report, paste it into their channel. And then this is also good because it's a really fast way for you to more easily create an after action report, because you have the central report all in one place. You could use that just straight up as an after action report, sort of more rudimentary after action report. So this has been a very long-winded video, but it's a very long and arduous subject matter. So hopefully this has helped people. Hopefully this has helped you make decisions in your own game design, because I know that the sort of medieval campaign area is something that a lot of people are trying to do, and a lot of people are doing a lot of very different things. They're approaching things in different ways, and I wanted to put all of my information in one place, all of the historical research that I've done in one place, so that anybody else can access it and just take it or leave it. There's a lot of advice on how to run different types of campaigns, but there's not a lot of advice online of how to run the sort of medieval campaigns. So that's why I wanted to make this video. Learn from my mistakes. Don't commit the same mistakes that I did. And yeah, anyways, that's the end of this video. Take care.